There is a strange paradox happening right now. We have more information available than at any point in human history. You can literally pull up your phone and access virtually the entire knowledge of humanity in seconds. And yet, we seem to trust experts less than ever before. We are living through what some philosophers call a crisis of epistemic authority, which is really just a fancy way of saying that we no longer agree on who gets to say what is true. And it raises a lot of questions that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. When is it rational to trust someone else's judgment over your own? And how do you identify genuine expertise when you're not an expert yourself? And what happens when the very idea of expertise becomes somewhat suspicious? So let's start with a philosophical concept that might sound abstract, but is actually very practical. Epistemic authority means the right to be believed about something. When your doctor tells you that you have high blood pressure, they're exercising epistemic authority. But the question is, what makes that authority legitimate? Well, for most of human history, this wasn't really a question that you had to ask. You simply trusted the priest, the elder, the scholar, or whoever held the recognized position of knowledge in your own community. But the modern world, of course, has shattered that model. The Protestant Reformation said individuals could interpret Scripture themselves, and the Enlightenment elevated reason over tradition. And modern science has showed that authorities could be wrong and that challenging them can actually lead to progress. So, distrust of authority has essentially become a Western virtue. And as a society, we value intellectual autonomy, the idea that you should think for yourself and not just accept what you're told. But we also recognize that we cannot possibly be experts in everything, even with unlimited access to knowledge. You still depend on other people's knowledge on a constant basis. You trust that the engineers who designed your car knew what they were doing, and you trust that the people who built your house understood structural integrity. And you even trust that your dentist knows more about teeth than you do. And so we have this sort of tension in society where intellectual autonomy tells us to think for ourselves, but epistemic dependence is unavoidable. So we need experts. But how do you maintain your autonomy while recognizing that other people know things that you don't? Well, the traditional answer was that you should learn to identify a genuine expert and then defer to them in appropriate circumstances. You don't need to understand cardiovascular medicine to trust your cardiologist. You just need to verify that they went to medical school, completed their residency, maintained their license, and have a good track record. You are outsourcing the detailed knowledge, but maintaining oversight of the credentialing process. But something has gone very wrong with this system. Trust in experts has been declining for decades. And the interesting question is why? According to the experts, one common explanation is that people have simply become more ignorant and more irrational. And that might be part of it. But that explanation is too simple. And it's also very insulting to the collective intelligence. It assumes that everyone who doubts experts is just stupid. And that's not a productive way to think about the problem. A better explanation starts with recognizing that experts have actually failed in some very visible ways. Just starting with the 2008 financial crisis, it happened despite armies of economists and financial experts. The Iraq War was justified with confident claims about weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be false. Public health authorities gave contradictory guidance during the pandemic and led to millions of people getting advice that was wrong. And these are not minor mistakes. These are systematic failures that have affected millions of people and cost lives and money. And it's not just big government or big companies. Everything has gotten worse. The way that our houses are built, the way that our cars are run, everything seems to be breaking down despite the experts telling us that everything is working as it should. And when experts get things wrong, especially in such public and consequential ways, it damages the entire system of trust. So people start asking, if the experts were wrong about that, what else are they wrong about? And this is actually a very reasonable question, not one that a stupid or ignorant person would ask. Healthy skepticism means not accepting claims just because someone with credentials made them. It means asking for evidence and being willing to question authority. The problem is that healthy skepticism can slide into something a little more destructive. Because there is a crucial difference between asking tough questions and assuming that everything you're being told is a lie. And conspiracy thinking takes skepticism and turns it into paranoia. Instead of being appropriately cautious about claims, conspiracy thinkers become bottomless pits of doubt about anything official, while being completely gullible about any alternative explanation. Research on conspiracy thinking has identified this pattern very clearly. Conspiracy believers are extremely skeptical of mainstream sources, but uncritically accept fringe claims. They interpret the absence of evidence as evidence. If there is no proof of a conspiracy, that just means that the cover-up is working very well. And this is not healthy, because skepticism means being willing to change your mind when evidence comes in. And conspiracy thinking means being immune to evidence. The distinction matters because right now we are seeing a lot of fake skepticism. People claim to be questioning authority when what they're actually doing is shopping for whatever narrative confirms what they already believe. But the problem is that we can't just tell people to trust the experts again, because they have repeatedly let society down. Trust is not just a switch that you can flip on and off. It actually has to be earned, and it has been damaged by some real failures. So we're stuck in this difficult position because we need experts, because modern life is too complex for anyone to understand everything. But the institutions that certify and regulate experts have lost their credibility. And this brings us to a psychological phenomenon that helps explain why this crisis is so hard to solve. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it is one of the most important insights from cognitive psychology. The basic finding is that people who know very little about a subject tend to dramatically overestimate their competence in that area. And meanwhile, people who are actual experts tend to assume that things that come easy to them must be easy for everyone else. And the reason that this happens is metacognition, which is essentially your ability to accurately assess your own knowledge. Metacognition requires that you know enough about a field to recognize what you don't know. And when you're completely ignorant about something, you don't even know what questions to ask or what complexities exist. Everything to you looks simple. But someone who has never studied medicine might think, how hard can a diagnosis be? You list the symptoms, match them to the disease, and prescribe the treatment. But an actual doctor knows that symptoms overlap, and that diseases present differently in different people, and that even medications that person might be on interact with each other, that patients don't always report accurately. So the complexity becomes visible only when you learn enough to see it, and this creates a huge problem. The people most confident in their ability to evaluate expert claims are often the people who are least qualified to do so. And the actual experts, who see all the complexity and uncertainty, often sound hesitant compared to the confident amateurs. In any debate between an expert carefully explaining nuances and a confident person making simple claims, the simple claims are always going to sound more convincing. And this gets weaponized in modern discourse. You see confident people with minimal expertise making absolutely wild claims, while the actual experts are saying things like, the evidence suggests, or we think this is probably true. And it sounds wishy washy. The amateur sounds decisive, but the expert is being honest about what knowledge actually looks like, while the amateur doesn't know enough to recognize how much they don't know. So, how in the world are we supposed to solve this problem? How do we rebuild trust and expertise without abandoning healthy skepticism? There is no simple answer, but philosophy does give us some tools. First, we need to understand that trusting experts does not mean blind faith. It means making an informed judgment that someone else is more likely to get the right answer than you are in a particular domain. Recognizing your own limitations is a form of wisdom. Second, we need better standards for identifying genuine expertise. Credentials matter to an extent, but so does track record. And so does whether someone updates their views when new evidence comes in. Real experts say, I don't know, and they acknowledge the limits of current knowledge. But the fake experts always have an answer. Third, we need to get much better at distinguishing levels of expertise. Just because someone has a PhD does not mean they're an expert in everything. And just because someone is an expert in one field does not make them an expert in another. Fourth, we need to cut some people some slack because science changes, and what we thought was true 10 years ago might be revised based on new evidence. This is not a failure of expertise or the system trying to manipulate you into getting to think a certain way. It's just how knowledge works. The problem is that we have created a culture where changing your mind is seen as weakness rather than honesty. And fifth, we need institutions that are actually trustworthy. And this is the hardest part. When institutions fail repeatedly and prioritize other interests over truth-telling, when they dismiss legitimate concerns, they are damaging their own authority. So rebuilding that authority requires not just competence, but transparency and accountability. The challenge we face is that modern life requires trusting people that you don't know about things that you don't understand. And that can be uncomfortable because it creates a vulnerability inside of you. And when that trust gets violated, whether through genuine mistakes or actual malfeasance, the temptation is to just stop trusting anyone. But that is not a viable solution. Because we can't all become experts in medicine and engineering and climate science and economics and everything else that affects our lives. But what we can do is get better at evaluating expertise without having the expertise ourselves. We can look at consensus among qualified people rather than cherry picking the one credentialed person who agrees with us. And this isn't foolproof because you can still get it wrong. People can fake credentials and be really good actors. But it is better than the alternatives, which are either blind trust in anyone with credentials or a blanket rejection of anyone claiming expertise, because both of those extremes leave you worse off. The deeper philosophical issue is about what it means to know something in a world that is too complex for any individual to understand. In the past, your own direct expertise was your primary source of knowledge. But now, most of what you believe based on testimony from others. Almost everything that you know about the world comes from trusting what other people have said. And that makes expertise foundational to modern knowledge. Without it, we are left with only what we can directly observe, which is an incredibly limited slice of reality. But it also means that failures of expertise are not just mistakes about facts. they are threats to the entire system of how we know things. And the crisis of expertise is really a crisis about how we collectively determine what is true. And that is not something that we can solve just by telling people to trust experts more or to think for themselves harder. It requires rebuilding institutions that are actually worthy of trust and creating mechanisms that are for accountability. And most importantly, teaching people how to navigate epistemic dependence without blind faith or paranoid rejection. And you cannot run a complex society when nobody agrees on basic facts. You can't solve problems when every expert opinion is just another opinion. So, the decline in trust of experts is not the result of people becoming more dumb. It's more a result about the collapse of shared mechanisms for determining truth. And rebuilding those mechanisms means grappling with hard philosophical questions about authority, autonomy, trust, and what it means to know something in the first place. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all next time.